Welcome to the Fragility Forum 2022 podcast series produced by the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group of the World Bank Group. As complexity and uncertainty become the new normal, with complex crises posing new challenges, from the COVID-19 pandemic to climate change, this podcast series explores how the international community can best support countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence in a fast-changing global landscape.
Hello, my name is Paul Biscay. I'm a fragility, conflict, and security consultant advising international organizations. I also co-host a different podcast called F-World, the Fragility Podcast. But today we are at the World Bank 2022 Fragility Forum podcast series, and we will be speaking about an important topic, the future of support for security sector governance and reform, security sector assistance in fragile and conflict-affected states, including important questions about affordability and public financial management and the links with economic development. I'm joined by two very knowledgeable and distinguished speakers in this conversation. Dr. Imogen Parsons is a senior fellow at the Conflict and Counterterrorism Group at the Royal United Services Institute in London, or RUSI, and His Excellency Ambassador Michal Mlynar. He's the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Slovakia to the United Nations. Welcome to both. Let's start with reminding ourselves a bit why this topic is so important. A lot has been written on this, a lot has been said, including by both of you, but recent events really show that effective, affordable, accountable, and efficient security forces are truly at the heart of efforts to escape fragility and conflict. Just if we think what's happened in the past year in Afghanistan, the central question last summer was, will the security forces fight the Taliban? Will an investment of $80 billion that took place over 20 years ultimately pay off? And we know what the result was. So basically, it calls into questions the model of security sector assistance that we have. In the Sahel, after years of involvement by the international community, we had a coup in Burkina Faso, we had a coup in Mali. In the Central African Republic, we have a situation whereby ultimately the state is hiring a private security company to perform state functions in security. We've also had failed coups attempts in Guinea-Bissau. So ultimately, beyond their human cost and the human implications, effective security outcomes matter for economic development. They matter because either huge infrastructure or education or health projects that are truly essential to lift these countries out of poverty can be stopped when insecurity takes place, or they can be very difficult to implement. And yet, despite the fact that now we have plenty of evidence of the interlinkages between security sector reform, so the long-term efforts to build effective and accountable security sector institutions, security sector assistance, so more of a short-term approach at making sure that the RMEs can function well, focus more on train and equip, and economic development, approaches that really combine all of them are not yet fully there. There's still a bit missing in action. So who gets stuck in the middle? It's the vulnerable communities in fragile and conflict-affected states. What can be done going forward? Ambassador, we start with you. As you have served as a co-chair of the Peacebuilding Commission until very recently. Slovakia is the co-chair of the Group of Friends of Security Sector Reform at the United Nations. You've also served as the chair of the International Security Sector Assistance team. So you have a wide range of experiences at the very heart of this debate. So let me ask you, what has worked and what needs to change when it comes to security sector reform and governance in fragile states? Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's great to have that conversation on security sector reform, governance, and assistance. Indeed, it's clearly an integral element of the United Nations sustaining peace and prevention agendas. It is both a preventive measure and a long-term development goal. And I would say that increasingly in recent years and months, we have been putting more and more emphasis on the governance aspect because experience has shown us that it is becoming increasingly a governance issue. At the same time, I would like to emphasize that SSR is above all a political process, and therefore we need to stress the importance of the UN role in advocating with governments and bilateral partners for greater coherence between SSR and peace processes. In fact, we are just about to receive the next UN Secretary General's comprehensive report on SSR. We are very excited, also in the context of the UN Group of Friends, to have a new opportunity to address the assistance that UN missions or other UN presences and UN agencies are giving to national governments and to other actors in this important area. As I have mentioned, really the main focus should increasingly be on governance. From the peace building perspective, I would emphasize that we have seen an increasing interest and participation of countries that have been on the Peace Building Commission agenda in this particular area. It was last December that we co-hosted together with the then chair of the Peace Building Commission, Egypt, the first ever thematic meeting of the Peace Building Commission focused on DDR and SSR, and we certainly hope to continue in that particular effort. Because we need to continue involving not only the national governments but other actors in this work. And we have recently seen also in the PBC context that it is possible to increase the participation of various actors in the processes. We have been able, despite the pandemic, to engage not only the national governments, but also the NGOs and other key stakeholders, including women and youth, that need to be part of the discussions from the outset. And this has, for a long time, been one of the challenges that we have been facing. Let me conclude here by emphasizing that the UN support to SSR is not only in peace operations, but it is also in non-mission settings in response to national requests, and in transition settings where peace operations are withdrawing, but where ongoing security sector assistance is needed. In societies emerging from conflict, security sector reform often is a determining, if not the determining factor for sustainable peace and development, early recovery, sustainable peace building, and stability in general.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, thank you. Very quick follow-up, 30-second question. What do you think is the hardest part about getting the governance of the technocratic part of SSR talk to the political part of SSR? Can you have a 1 minute, 30-second sort of remark that you believe is the most difficult challenge to get that across, and how can we solve it?
Yes, I think the most difficult challenge is the participation of wide enough array of actors and all the important stakeholders. Often we have the buy-in of national governments, but the buy-in does not necessarily end at signing agreements or contracts with the donors or with other actors, but the challenge is how to translate the commitments into practical life. And that only happens when a wide enough range of stakeholders and actors is genuinely engaged.
Okay, great. So now let's shift a bit the conversation towards the security sector assistance part. So we now know, at least for many people listening to us today, security sector assistance is very much tied to concepts or operations like stabilization, counterterrorism, and counterinsurgency. Dr. Parsons, how has the relationship between these three sort of concepts evolved? And do you think, given the drawdown of operations in the Sahel, given what happened in Afghanistan, do you believe it's time to rethink the relationship between these concepts? Dr. Parsons.
Great. Thanks, Paul, and thanks for having me here today. First of all, I think let's be clear about what we're talking about when we talk about security sector assistance or indeed reform and governance. I think we need to separate the activities from the concepts you refer to, so whether that's stabilization, counterterrorism or counterinsurgency. I think what's really important is that we're really clear about what the goals of each of the activities are, whether that's the assistance or the reform and governance work, and whether or not they support a broader concept or strategy. They're not quite the same thing. So I think it's important to separate the activities from what they're trying to achieve and then try and work through that. So if I just sort of recap a few of the big lessons and experiences of the last 20 years or so in a bit of a whirlwind tour, places like Sierra Leone brought some really useful lessons around the need to build civilian institutions and oversight when doing SSR work, as well as around the length of time that work can take. And I think that's one of the big things I'll come back to that we consistently keep forgetting. In places like Afghanistan, it's not that we didn't know that, the lesson hadn't been completely forgotten, but the operational pressures of conflict, especially in the south, drove, I think, a much more sort of military and security focused approach with more emphasis on the direct security assistance and less on the institutions. The plans and the strategies were there and the people to do it were there, but the balance shifted and the emphasis shifted. And I think that sort of unbalanced the entire strategy and approach in Afghanistan. And I think that's probably a lot of the cause of what we saw happen in the end. So what I think we've seen more recently is a sort of a shift away from these really big, broad, multi-sectoral, hugely ambitious interventions to ones that are more narrowly focused on counterterrorism or counterinsurgency, for instance. And on one level, that makes sense because having more tightly defined goals should be easier to achieve. But the problem is that those interventions can be initially effective in accomplishing security goals, but then have much more negative longer term effects, worsening internal conflict by exacerbating human rights violations, for instance, or unbalancing the political settlement and economy of the state by strengthening the military and the groups that they're linked to, for example. We've seen multiple cases where heavy-handed security actions can deepen the grievances against the state or indeed against international forces and make their presence unsustainable, as we may now be seeing in the Sahel. It's hard now, I think, to imagine the international community willingly embarking on a really long-term intervention. But that is the kind of consistency we need, unfortunately. And even then, in places where there was an intervention for decades, in the Balkans, for instance, there are still signs later on of the settlement starting to fracture a little. So as that sort of willingness to intervene directly decreases as well, I think it's also worth bearing in mind that we're seeing this new model appearing as well of working through local forces. I say new, it's not new, of course. It was very much the norms of 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But it seems to be coming back. It was done in Syria. We're hearing a lot of talk about doing that again in Ukraine. And while it's not new, it's a challenging model that I think we'll come back to a bit about that, because there are a lot of different factors, different things going on, and the absence of the institutions that you might have even in more conventional intervention contexts. What I'll do then is I'll just point quickly to two things that I think are needed now. Firstly, there are obviously some big gaps in the dialogue and the coordination between peace, security and development actors. So we need to fix that. We need to get more structured and regular dialogue in order to talk about these concepts, in order to understand the risks, to build on the comparative advantages of different actors. We're moving away from these sort of grand ambitions, as I say, of multi-agency, multi-sectoral approaches. But the need for coordination between those different actors, I think, is stronger than ever, actually. There's a real risk that in trying to be sort of narrow and more focused in goals, the international community will lose sight of the bigger picture of the way that the different activities contribute or not to different, much bigger goals, and might undermine instead of boosting stability in the medium to longer term. And secondly, and after that, I will finish, I promise. I think we need more evidence of effectiveness of different approaches, whether that's the narrow security sector assistance or wider reform and governance work. The international community has spent huge amounts of money, tens of billions of dollars, with really questionable results in some cases. The amount of money that has gone into security assistance work absolutely dwarfs the amount that's gone into the wider reform and governance work, as well as into other forms of aid. It is a very large amount of money, and I think we really need to kind of wrap our heads much more around what works, what doesn't, why not when it hasn't worked, and include in things like cultural and behavioural change and respect for human rights as being really central and important factors.
So you point out to this dichotomy between, on the one hand, reduced ambitions globally, given the current context in the world, but also the fact that the problems that we're trying to solve are growing, and in a way that their complexity is not shrinking by any means. And in fact, this is a good segue to our next question, because we've seen quite a number of anomalies you pointed out just now between the huge amounts of funding that goes into security sector assistance compared to security sector reform, but also the different channels and alignment and management of efforts to boost the effectiveness of the security sector in whichever way, and those to basically ensure that there are links with peace and development objectives. So, Mr. Ambassador, back to you now. So what do you think we should really focus on to ensure the greater alignment between the peace and development side of the equation and the security side?
Indeed, thanks very much. And I would pick up where Dr. Parsons has left it on the nexus between security and development. It's true that now it's been widely acknowledged, but the question remains how we are able collectively to do better in practical terms. That remains a challenge. The reform or the governance of the security sector, particularly in conflict-affected societies, creates an environment conducive to political and socio-economic growth. I think that's a key message that we should be able to amplify even more. And as you know, the joint UN World Bank study, Pathways for Peace, noted, and I quote, security and justice institutions that operate fairly and in alignment with the rule of law are essential to preventing violence and sustaining peace. And that remains very much relevant. We just need to continue addressing different ways how to do better on that particular aspect. And I believe the best answer to that is through enhancing and widening partnerships. And in fact, that has been at the center of our attention also currently. Of course, UN plays a key role as a norm setter, as a convener, as a global guarantor of approaches to SSGR, but it cannot do enough on its own. It desperately needs partners, including those who can assist and provide the necessary financing. Of course, it includes bilateral donors, but it includes other international organizations, including the international financial institutions. And a lot of good work has been done, in particular, as I have mentioned, between the UN and the World Bank. But we have been falling short of getting the necessary impact in the field and translating all these good commitments into sustainable and durable results. So with the legitimacy and effectiveness of the UN approach to SSR, it should take us to the next level, together with actors such as the African Union, the European Union, the OSCE, but also the sub-regional organizations, because we have seen increasingly how much of an important role ECOWAS, for example, has been playing in the Sahel context, just to mention one of the practical examples. And if we are able to even better join forces and focus our efforts also on public expenditure reviews, as well as with civil society and expert organizations, including ISET and DCAF, where, as you have mentioned earlier, I've been involved over many years. We can do better. So I really would put a lot of emphasis on the partnerships and events like the Fragility Forum, but also our regular meetings in the Peace Building Commission are good opportunities for that. We are soon going to have a high-level event in the UN General Assembly, which will be specifically focused on peace building financing. We are ensuring, together with the UN Group of Friends, that the SSR context is sufficiently addressed as part of the wider peace building efforts, because often it is somehow marginalized, and that's another challenge that we are facing. So these are some of the practical aspects that I wanted to cover.
So quite a handful of challenges you have to deal with. Dr. Parsons, the ambassador just mentioned sustainability, financing, and many of the same challenges apply to security sector assistance. What does a sustainable future for a more effective SSA look like?
Okay, so not a small question there, but I'll try and pick out a few key points. So first of all, on the financing, I think a lot more clarity on what is being spent, where, by who, and on what would really help, with stronger coordination, but also transparency and a really strong effort to prevent diversion and corruption. Because the volumes of money we're talking about are really not small, and there's always a risk with that kind of transfer of resources that some goes wrong around the edges or in a more substantive way, and I think that's really important to try and tackle. What that means, I think, is security assistance programs have got to work with ministries of finance as well as the defence and interior ministries, and look at questions around regulatory and financial management mechanisms. In other words, I think security sector assistance has to be tied into broader reform and governance work, and that can take years or decades, and we just have to accept that that's a fact and deal with it. The second thing is, I think we have to be clear in launching any security sector assistance activities or programs about what the goal is. We need to be clear why we're doing it, to what end, and what the risks and the unintended consequences are, locally as well as nationally, and at regional and global levels even. And we need to be clear about how we can mitigate those risks, not think that a short-term security impact is worth it somehow, because or means that any wider consequences are okay, because it doesn't. I think we have to grapple with that much more seriously. At the same time, I think we need to recognise, and it gets forgotten sometimes, that security sector assistance can and often does have positive short-term impacts, and there's a lot there that could be harnessed to the benefit of wider work and longer-term work. It can bring security to communities that really need it. It can help to build confidence in and within security forces and even in the state. There's a lot of really positive things that can come from it. So let's try and build on those, harness those, and tie those in from the perspective of development and other actors. See it as a potential positive. The different models I talked about, working with a central government that has strong institutions versus working with local, even resistance forces, are very different. And I think it's worth also recognizing that. And we're going to have to think really hard, if we're going to do more work with local forces, about what that looks like and how to influence norms and behaviors in the absence of clear hierarchies and institutions, because it's a different kind of approach. On this, I would commend some work that the ICRC did on roots of restraint and conflict, which actually points really nicely to the way that culture can be influenced through working through smaller local groups, that you don't necessarily need a big hierarchy to do it. It's a really good study. The next thing I've made the case already, I guess, for aligning security sector assistance with reform and governance, especially when we're thinking about sort of transition and looking to the future of countries. And I'm sure it sounds overwhelming to people who are thinking, well, we really just want to get in there and fix a short-term problem, to say, no, you've got to have a long-term strategy and a plan. But the first thing, I suppose, is that a lot of countries do have strategies and plans. They may lack the resources to deliver them, but look at what's there already. Look at what's there to start with. Don't assume there's nothing. And those countries that don't have those kind of strategies and plans, where the assistance is really supply driven, or where the assistance ignores it and just focuses, take the classic case primarily on training and equipment. I think those are some of the countries where we've seen the biggest problem, spreading insecurity, repeated coups. So I think that kind of makes the case that we can't get away from this. And just another couple of points for things that have come up to an extent already: human rights, gender, youth. Really needing to embed these essential in the approach, not just as a legal constraint or as a target, but as a critical success factor in doing this work really well. Because as I say, one thing we've learned is that culture really matters. And that means also some different skills. So there's sometimes a bit of a tendency to think that security sector assistance means training the military, but actually policing skills internally can be even more important. Soft community engagement skills, not just the train and equip.
So speaking of skills and culture, I'd like to ask you a final question. Ambassador, you've been a diplomat. You've been at the heart of UN efforts to improve security sector reform and governance. Dr. Parsons, you were an advisor to a field commander in Afghanistan, I believe. I'm curious, what would you want, let's say if the two of you had met in a particular setting in the field, Dr. Parsons, what would you like diplomats to know that's important on effective security sector assistance? And Mr. Ambassador, what would you want the advisors of field commanders to know?
Okay, shall I go first?
Go first, yes.
Okay, what would I want diplomats to know? I would want them to know that long-term consistency matters, and that all the work they do with governments, all the diplomatic engagement, all of that sort of softer work is as important as the work that the military are doing, and it has to be joined up and it has to work together. That if the military come in and train soldiers to shoot better, that'll have one sort of effect, but in the absence of sustained work with a government to embed all the sort of cultural institutional changes that are needed, it won't deliver in the long term. You can use the military as a short-term fix for problems. They're very good at that, but really that's what it is. And if they're tied into a longer-term plan, they'll deliver their part of that, but it is only one part.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Great, thanks very much. I think we are very much aligned on the issue of short-term versus long-term. That has evolved in recent years a lot. And the one thing that strikes out to me in this context is really that SSR needs to be anchored in national ownership and be locally designed and led. And this is where we need our advisors, our stakeholders, whether it's NGOs, think tanks, and others who are involved. And we need to be able to better align ourselves in those contexts. It is often, as Dr. Parsons has mentioned, the military that provide the short term, the quick fixes in a way. And where I see the greatest challenge is really how to even better bridge that short term, the military part, with the long-term development aspects. Often our development colleagues in the field are still shying away from getting even more involved at a certain point in the peace and security related issues, claiming that they have no mandate for peace and security, or that they are not experts in that area. And this is where our advisors and our partners can help us really advocate with the development community even better, that these things need to be better coordinated, but also that we need to address the linkages in a very real way. When Slovakia served in the past 2 years as Peace Building Commission member, we have been advocating for the 3 C's a lot: coherence, complementarity, and coordination. And I think that this captures quite well some of the challenges that remain there. Of course, I fully agree with what Dr. Parsons has mentioned about the role of women and youth and their full involvement in all stages of peace processes and SSR-related work, because indeed gender-sensitive SSR is key to developing security sector institutions in a long-term, non-discriminatory, representative, inclusive manner. Otherwise, sooner or later, things will start falling apart.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador and Dr. Parsons. Thanks to both of you for a really fascinating conversation. We certainly hope that the development types, once they hear what you had to say, they will become less shy, if not more adventurous in helping these efforts in fragile states. It's just to wrap up, perhaps to notice just how much, how interlinked these themes are. You cannot do effective SSR or SSA without a good knowledge of politics, a good knowledge of military affairs, but obviously economics and culture. So it's really a truly transversal effort. For all these issues to be looked at in depth, I would strongly recommend to our listeners that they check out a new paper by the OECD and the United Nations Security Sector Reform Unit, looking precisely at the future of security sector reform and security sector governance and assistance in fragile states. A huge thanks to our hosts, the World Bank Fragility Forum 2022. We certainly hope that you enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
This wraps up this episode of the podcast series. Thank you for listening, and please check out our other podcasts. For that, and to learn more about the World Bank Group efforts in environments affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, please visit our website www.worldbank.org/FCV.